want to talk about regime change in Iran. Now, when you hear that term, regime change, it's you probably react to it as if it's a dirty word, a dirty term. You think of immediately what happened in Iraq, thousands of dead, trillions of dollars wasted, or maybe Afghanistan, or maybe both. But there's another rather recent example of regime change that we frequently forget that had a very less costly, especially in terms of lives, outcome, and was very successful. It was probably the most successful regime change ever conducted in recent history, maybe even modern history, certainly in the 20th century. What was that? That was the collapse of the Soviet Union during the Reagan and Bush years, the 12 years that they were president. It brought down the Soviet Union. Now, what people don't seem to recognize, certainly in the media, either because they're too stupid to recognize it or because they don't want to recognize it, just as people didn't want to recognize anything what Reagan was doing because he was supposedly some sort of dunce who just dozed off through the day and took naps, is that this same strategy, basically, that was employed against the USSR, against the Soviet Union back in the 1980s, is being employed today by the Trump administration against Iran. Now, will it succeed? If Trump is reelected and this goes on for another 4 years, it might. It might not. Nobody really knows. But one thing I can say with metaphysical certainty is that if Joe Biden becomes president, progressives take power in this country, it's going to be the end of the strategy, and the mullahs in Tehran will survive for the foreseeable future. Now, in simple terms, trying to keep this video short, what was the Reagan strategy that brought about regime change in the Soviet Union? It had several elements, one of which was a variety of sanctions that were placed on the USSR. Another, and a critical one, had to do with prices, commodity prices especially. The Soviets made their cash that they needed to do all the other things, buy food because they couldn't produce enough grain because of their ridiculous system they had to feed their own people, and especially to buy more sophisticated computer and electronic technology that they needed for their military and the state apparatus. And their main sources of income came from the sales of gold and the sales of oil. The Soviet Union, Russia today, is one of the leading oil producers and natural gas producers in the world, energy in general. There was a military buildup, the American military buildup, that under the Reagan years, the 600-ship Navy, expansion of the Army, modernization of the Army, same with the Air Force. All this put pressure on the Soviet Union, and they, of course, tried to match it, which meant upgrading their nuclear arsenal, upgrading their conventional arsenal. But because technology, military technology had changed, and the new weapon systems were much more sophisticated, much more electronic and computer-based, to do that was an entirely different endeavor for the Russians. In the old industrial days, they could just crank out a lot of tanks or a lot of MiG-21s. The tanks and aircraft they were producing and ships in this period were high-tech. So instead of making, 1,000 MiG-21s, they were making 100 MiG-29s. So their numbers were actually going down. And to buy the sophisticated stuff that they needed abroad, or components and things, cost a lot of money. And what was happening with the Russians was because we were pressing them on commodity prices, and Reagan did this in a variety of ways. One way was not going anti-apartheid with South Africa, and in response what the South Africans did was they just mined a lot of gold, which brought down the price of gold. The other thing the United States did, working with Britain and Norway, with North Sea oil, and with the Saudis, which was critical, is pump a lot of oil onto the market, which brought the price down. Some of you may remember, if you lived through that, gas went under $1 a gallon for a while. It was like 99 cents. I remember buying gas. And of course, this was killing the Soviets because one of their biggest sources of income was selling petroleum and natural gas. And all this, as those prices came down, they were bringing less income in, and they were spending more income trying to keep up with the United States militarily. So your income's down, your expenses are going up. This is how you head toward bankruptcy if you're living at home and you have a household. When your expenses go up and your income goes down, you got a problem. The other thing the Reagan administration did was to push resistance all over the place. You may remember, things going on with, we were putting pressure on Cuba, which is supported by the Soviet Union, so that cost them more money. It never brought down the Cuban regime. That really wasn't the intent, but the point was it made the Cubans even more resistance on the relying more on the Soviet Union, and that cost the Russians more money. And there was, Grenada. You had what was going on in El Salvador, other places in Central America, in Africa, in Angola, in Afghanistan. Remember, we were arming the Mujahideen over there, and all these things were costing the Russians more money. We're also causing them problems closer to home. We were working with Pope John Paul, who was, from Poland, and you had even the American labor unions were involved in this, working with Solidarity and supporting them against the communist regime. And all this was causing trouble in Eastern Europe for the Russians, and it was costing them more money. You had the deployment of Pershing missiles into Europe, which people protested all over Europe trying to get them out, but Reagan held fast. And the Russians matched that with more missiles. But of course, all this is causing more and more expenses for the Soviet Union. And its money, at the same time, their income basically is going down. And this is a real problem. Now, what happened? The Soviets held on throughout Reagan's first term. They used their control of protests and everything around the world, all their little groups that they had a hand in that they could get to go out and bang drums in front of the White House and stuff like that. But Reagan was reelected easily in 1984. And it's no coincidence that the next year, 1985, or actually the same year Reagan starts his second term, the Soviets faced this dilemma. What do? We can't keep going on the way that we're going on. Our income is down, our costs are going up. What do? So what did they do? They brought in Mikhail Gorbachev. You remember the guy who had the map of Afghanistan tattooed on his forehead, as people used to joke. And he tried to cut things off, slow things down. Remember the meetings at Reykjavik with Reagan, new arms control agreements. And he also started the process of glasnost, perestroika, openness, reform, trying to bring about changes within the Soviet Union. And this happened because of what had happened in Reagan's first term. And ultimately, we know what happened to the Soviet Union after that. It started to basically unravel, because once you took away the fear factor, once you took away the terror factor that had been central to Soviet rule since 1917, and people realized that there weren't going to be crackdowns, they weren't going to get sent off to the Gulag, they weren't going to be executed, things just started heating up, and gradually, it's really the Bush administration where things just come totally unglued as a revolution, and the Soviet Union collapsed. It literally fell apart. I mean, the Baltic states fell off, Belarus, Ukraine, all the stands out there in Central Asia, just moved away from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union imploded. It collapsed as a result of this process. And maybe their last chance was in 1988 if Michael Dukakis had won, but he lost too. So you basically were looking at 12 years of pressure on the USSR, and ultimately it literally fell apart. Now, if you look at what's going on during the Trump administration with regard to Iran, you see the same pattern. Sanctions of all types, commodity prices, oil. What's the Trump administration been doing with its allies, the Saudis around the world? Pumping oil. The United States is now the world's largest oil producer. The Saudis are pumping oil too. All this is bringing prices down. I mean, it wasn't that long ago we were paying between $4 and $5 a gallon. The other day I paid $1.99 a gallon. Gas prices are lower. What that means for the Iranians, between the sanctions and the drop in the price of gas, is that their main, I think it's 40% of their annual budget comes from oil sales, or it used to come from oil sales. It's not coming from oil sales today, because they can't export their oil. They can ship it out to Venezuela. We're not going to stop that. But that's just more expense, because they're not getting paid by Venezuela. I think actually maybe they got some gold or something, but it's all strain on the Iranian economy. The other thing you're seeing is resistance. Suddenly, since Trump's been in office, if you look around all the places that the Iranians are involved, you see resistance. Yemen, you got the Saudis in there, fighting back against the Houthis. Now, are they going to wipe out the Houthis or win the war in Yemen? No, that's not the point. The point is the Iranians have to step up support and spend more money to keep the Houthis going. The same thing's going on in Lebanon. You've got protests going on in Lebanon against a government that's in cahoots with Hezbollah, which is controlled basically by Iran. That means they're spending more money in Lebanon trying to prevent the loss of political control there. You got the same thing going on in Iraq right now. The Iranians were sort of in like Flint in Iraq. They controlled the Iraqi government, and it looked like it was, pretty much a pro-Iran show. And to some extent, the government still is, but there are all these other groups that are suddenly popping up and having, anti-Iranian protests. There are anti-Iranian militia units coming out. And is that going to overthrow the regime and move it away from Iranian control? Probably not. But again, the Iranians have to spend more money in Iraq to hold on to what they have. Syria is another case in point. I mean, Syria has been fighting the civil war now for just a little under a decade. They have no economy. Where do they get their money? I mean, the Russians aren't giving them money. The Russians don't have any money to give them. They'll give them military support for sure, but they're not bankrolling them. Who's been bankrolling Syria all these years? Iran. Nobody really knows. I've seen estimates that are, in the tens of billions of dollars that they've given the Syrians. But what you're starting to see, if you look carefully at some stories here and there, you'll see that suddenly the Syrians are cutting back on things. Why are they cutting back? Because the money's not coming in from Iran anymore, at least not as much of it. Again, you're increasing the cost to do business in Syria for the Iranians. And so if you look at Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, all these places where the Iranians are in deep and have these groups they need to support, they're still supporting them, they're still holding on, but it's costing them ever more money, more and more money, while at the same time at home, they have less money coming in. That 40% of their budget is largely gone. So they've got this huge hole in their budget. And how are they going to make this up? What are they going to do? What do they do internally for this? Now, if you look at Iran internally, and you ask the question, is this strategy working? I would say that it is. I mean, what do we know about what's going on in Iran? Well, you've had a load of unrest back in the fall, and you have more unrest now because of how they mishandled the COVID-19 outbreak. And, who knows what's going to happen when that's over. So there's an increasing unrest in Iran. Now, you can argue for or against that ever being critical in getting rid of the regime, but it's still there. It costs more money. What are some other things we know going on in Iran? One is, again, they don't have a lot of money. So what are they doing? Taxes are going up. That takes more money out of people's pockets. And at the same time, they're cutting subsidies for products, which means the things people have to buy, the price is going up. So basically, if you're an Iranian citizen, your amount of money you're bringing in is going down after, your income after they take taxes out, and your costs are going up. So economically, you're in an ever worse situation. Now, does that mean all these people are going to go out and rebel against the mullahs? Probably not, but some of them will start changing their minds about what's going on. Where does this end? And another problem you have in Iran is inflation. Now, it's come down a bit over the last year or two, but it's still, coming down a bit means it's still a little over 20%. I think last month it was close to 3%. Now, what's that mean when inflation is going on? Well, one of the things the Iranians did recently was reduce their currency by, lopping off zeros. I think it was like the equivalent of a $100 bill became a $1 bill. So it didn't look like you were paying millions of dollars for things when you were really only paying $100. But there are other things they're doing. Again, they're cutting the subsidies. They're cutting this. They're cutting that. What they're doing is they're suffering from inflation. And that's taking money out of people's pockets. It means it's impossible to save. If you want something and you can't afford it and you save for it, your savings will be eroded as quickly as you save. If you're living on a fixed income or you have accumulated cash wealth, it's being destroyed. If you have $100,000, if you were in the U.S. and you had $100,000 and you lose 20% of that every year, roughly, in 5 years you have no retirement left. Your wealth is gone. Your family's wealth is destroyed. I mean, if you have property, that will be going up in value to compensate for that. So that's a good reason. You want to buy, you protect yourself from inflation. But where do you get the cash to buy? So inflation basically, erodes things and undermines things. We had high inflation. Remember the misery rating under the Carter administration? He lost to Ronald Reagan. It undercuts you politically. Is this enough to make the Iranian regime give up and fold up, collapse? I'm sure it isn't. There's also evidence that one of the things they're doing is cutting back. Now, I'm just beginning to see stories about this here and there, but it does look like they're cutting back on support for Syria. Suddenly Assad's cutting programs and reducing things and doing that, which tells me he's not getting money in from Tehran. So basically the Iranians, I think, are already at the point where they can't sustain themselves internally and sustain themselves externally in places like Yemen. They're supporting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. You've got Lebanon, you've got Syria, you've got Iraq. They just don't have the cash for all this stuff anymore, and they don't have Barack Obama sending them pallets of cash like he did after he signed the JCPOA agreement. So these are all problems that are building. Now, is this going to cause regime change in Iran? And my answer is we don't know. As I said, if Trump loses and the Democrats take over, the sanctions will come off, we'll go back to the nuclear agreement, and cash will start rolling into Iranian coffers. They'll start selling oil worldwide, and the pressure will come off. Does that mean that they'll be able to hold on? Not forever, but for the foreseeable future, they're more likely to be able to hold on. But if Trump wins, if Trump is reelected, and they're facing 4 more years of this, then the question becomes, can they hold on another 4 years? And I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that. Will we see, if Trump is reelected, will we see the equivalent of Gorbachev popping up in Iran, trying to find some way out of the dilemma that they're in, which is what happened in 1985 after Reagan was reelected? I don't know. I think the Iranian regime, the Mullahs, are a lot less flexible than even the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was. I mean, there had always been reform elements within the Communist Party going back to the 1960s and Khrushchev. I don't think that really exists in Iran. We have this thing of hardliners and moderates, but their moderates are really just a subset of hardliners. So that's the question: is if Trump is reelected, what will happen over the next 4 years? And while I can say with certainty that if Biden's elected, nothing's likely to happen in the next 4 years. If Trump is reelected, it's conceivable that something could happen, because the Iranians can't maintain these pressures forever. At some point, they either have to spend more money on keeping their people happy, and that would mean giving up in Yemen, giving up in cutting support to Hamas, cutting support to Hezbollah, cutting support in Lebanon, cutting support, letting Assad go down the drain, losing part of their grip or maybe all of their grip on Iraq. Are they willing to do that? But if they're not willing to do that, what do they do at home as the pressures mount? Can they keep raising taxes? Can they keep cutting subsidies? How long can they do that? Can they sustain a high rate of inflation that's eroding people's confidence in the economy, destroying wealth, destroying inheritances, destroying all these other things? It's not going to do them well at home. I'm not saying it's going to be bad enough that they'll obviously be overthrown. But, if you look at, aggregate public opinion models, where you're not moving, it's not like this is the Iranian public opinion and you move it one way or the other. The aggregate model is you're working on individual Iranians who through their own experiences and their own relationships to the government start changing their mind. That's what happens. How many people who go bankrupt, or how many of these college students, if they have a relatively good internal education system, higher education system, and they're cranking out all these college graduates who by some reports have a 40 to 50% unemployment rate. So if you just gotten out of some technical university and you have a degree in engineering and you can't find a job, does that mean you're going to revolt? No. But does it mean you're going to love the mullahs more, or love them less, or maybe love them not at all? And remember, revolutions aren't made by majorities. That's an important thing to keep in mind. The American Revolution, about a third of the people were patriots. A third were Tories, roughly, more or less. And then you had another third who just didn't give a crap. If you look at the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks numbered in the thousands. I mean, there may have been 2,500 in St. Petersburg when they overthrew the provisional government. The French Revolution was made by a thin minority of activists. We think that revolutions are these mass movements, and occasionally they are, but usually they're not. You have a minority that comes together and is active and aggressive and committed. And then you have a decline in the people who are willing to oppose them. They don't necessarily support them, but they don't oppose them. And that's how a minority can come to power. And we see it all the time in world history. So you don't need 51% of the Iranian people to become intent on getting rid of the regime. You need an ever larger percent, but still a minority, who are committed enough and active enough to go about doing it. And you need an ever larger percentage of the population who, while they're not enamored of the regime, wouldn't care if it disappeared. And somewhere in that mix is the tipping point where you can end up losing control. And again, I'm not predicting that if Trump's reelected in 4 years, we're going to see that happen. But if Trump was reelected in 4 years, we're more likely to see that happen. Whereas if Biden is elected, we're almost certainly will not see that happen. And that's basically what I'm trying to get at in this video. But what we're seeing is just what the media is ignoring, either because they're too stupid to recognize it, or they don't want to recognize it, because that would make it look like Trump was pursuing a coherent policy, which he is with regard to Iran. It's happening, and we're not seeing it. We're not being told about it. It's not being explained, but it's going on, just as it went on during the Reagan administration, where the media didn't report it, nobody was talking about it. But I worked for the Department of Defense in those days, and believe me, it was happening. And there have been people who've written books about it since. It was going on, and we know what the result was. So this is a different form of regime change. This isn't, Trump doesn't want to get into a war with Iran any more than Reagan wanted to get into a war with the Soviet Union. What both of them wanted to do, or want to do, in Trump's part, is to maximize the pressure on the Soviet Union in Reagan's part, Iran in Trump's part, maximize the pressure, maximize their costs, minimize their income, and then let that pressure build and see what happens. And we know what happened with regard to the Soviet Union. We'll see, if Trump's reelected, what happens with regard to Iran. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. Appreciate that. I do read them, the few that I get. And hit the notification button so you'll know when next time I post a new video. And until the next time, I am out of here.